I just think it was interesting. So this is the empiricist we picked because he's thought of as sort of the most thoroughgoing empiricist of the three of Locke, Berkeley, Hume. And yet the most famous idea of empiricism, tabula rasa, right, that we are born as a blank slate and all of our knowledge comes through experience, is not actually something that Hume seems to concern himself with.
Right. And of course he's refuting that, because for someone like Locke, it was important that causality be out there in the world and be something that we are taking in. And for Hume, there's no such thing. It's just a habit of mind.
But and I think that's, again, related to Hume's picture of all experiences, like we're sitting in this theater and some things are going on, and some of them are, things like colors that we would talk about as being outside, but some of them are your own emotions. You're watching all of that. It's just the play of images. We don't know where they come from. Saying some of them come from us and some of them come from outside, it's kind of a meaningless distinction. There's just the theater, whereas Locke does not have that picture.
Yeah, so should we discuss association? Are we ready for that?
Sure. Section 3.
Yeah, so there's a connection between thoughts or ideas of the mind. Again, where ideas are just copies of the impressions. And those connections can happen in three ways: through resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect.
Right.
Resemblance,
Resemblance and contiguity are obviously ones that just refer to surface level characteristics of the images. Right. At least it seems like that. Right. Like you could talk, in what sense do things resemble each other? I mean, there could be two situations in which, are very different in the simple perceptions involved in them. So let's say two instances where you think you're in danger. There's so many different situations where you could be in danger. It's not like the resemblance between them is like, whenever there's a bear, there's danger. There's lots of different dangerous things, but yet they all have this resemblance in a slightly less direct way, right? It's not just two things that are red.
Well, yeah, and it can be resemblance of complex ideas, right? So it could just mean a dog here and then a dog later. So that's the basic idea of resemblance, where, of course, again, what's important to note about each of these is that they're relational. So it's not like there's some ontological foundation to the resemblance, meaning there's not going to be an object within experience, which is a further foundation to the resemblance. So similarity is not among the little train of ideas that's happening in our mind. Hume is very close to idealism. It's hard to see how he escapes it. And we'll get to the famous passage where he rejects the idea of a external object.
Right. That being the definition of idealism for folks, that is that external objects are not real, that there's only our own ideas. That's all that actually exists.
Yeah.
So, Chapter 3, he has established ideas are only associated by resemblance, continuity in time or place, and cause and effect, although he doesn't really tell us what cause and effect means at that point to him, because it's something weird.
It's weird because Section 3 is very short, and it just kind of like, it's like bullet pointed, it's like, here's these things, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're on to the next. The key point to take away is that he says, you just don't have ideas that kind of stand alone and that you have one thought and that you have a single thought and that's it. He says, when you have an idea, you're naturally led to other ideas. There's this kind of motion, if you will, in your consciousness from one idea to the next. And what he was trying to say is that there's a chain of ideas and that you're brought from one idea to the next through one of these three mechanisms. Like you think of something and you're reminded of something that's similar to it, or you think of something and you're reminded of something that's contiguous with it. Like I think of my car and I immediately think of my driveway, right? Or you think of something and then you think of what follows from it. If I think of a plane crash, I think of people dying, right? Or whatever the case may be. And that he's trying to say that your mind works this way. You have ideas and you move from idea to idea to idea. And there's some logic or some order at least and method to how that gets done. And that he thinks that these three methods and maybe four kind of cover most of the bases of the ways that you do that.
Which you could kind of see, just to name drop from a recent episode. But Hegel's logic had a similar kind of basis, like Hegel was reading Hume, or was a historical outgrowth of what Hume was thinking, that we have just these ideas that sort of naturally lead to one another. And Hegel really took that and ran with it. That became like his whole freaking theory.
It's important to note that impression, it's not like there's still a given or a impressions. It's not like the mind can choose which impressions to have or something like that.
It's just like you have this flow of ideas in your head and they're being intermixed with impressions.
But there's the association of free association and imagination, but then there's the association that takes impressions which themselves appear according to something non-mental, right? It's not like that it's a mere association to go from one impression to the next. That's determined by something mind independent. But what connects them, what allows us to hold them together in a meaningful way, are concepts of resemblance and cause and effect, for instance.
Yes.
So it's not just a sound and fury signifying nothing. It's something that gets organized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, remember, the name of the book is Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, right? He's like, this is the way our understanding works. Absolutely.
Right, and he's using understanding. So when did all this faculty psychology stuff that we're going to see all over in Kant? I noticed this in Locke as well. Hume seems to not take it as seriously. Like he says, other people talk about faculties of the mind as if they're sort of independent entities that were dealing with each other, whereas I just talk about them as just something we can do. But he still kind of uses this term. It's the understanding is the part of the mind that takes these simple ideas and screws with them and makes them into complexes, right? He at least uses it that much. This becomes really, really important for Kant, right? Because you have the understanding, and then reason is something beyond that can do other things.
Well, I think we get all the things that we'll see when we do Kant. We get sensibility and imagination and understanding and reason. Kant is going to pick up this Humean framework. I mean, almost everything in this reading he's going to go with and expand, basically. But yeah, I agree, he's not emphasizing faculty as much, but he's certainly talking about faculties. For instance, the imagination he calls the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, and he does require memory also, a quote-unquote faculty of memory, although he doesn't explicitly acknowledge that, but it's required for any of this stuff to go.
I felt that was important to bring up because it's such a stumbling block for me when analyzing. I mean, if this is Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, sounds like a work of psychology, but modern psychologists are not going to recognize any of this faculty psychology talk. It's just very foreign to them. They wouldn't talk in this way at all because it's all very introspective, but it's kind of theoretical as well. It's like saying, instead of there's the cerebellum that does something and the parietal lobe that does something, that's the way a neuroscientist might talk now, that it's these different faculties. Well, where are they housed? What do they do? Does talking about a faculty, are you really mashing something together, or does this really reflect how the mind works in any meaningful way?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, Mark, because, too, he starts off talking about moral philosophy and mentions metaphysics, too, but he's not really doing metaphysics.
He's telling you why it's not possible to do metaphysics.
Right.
He's trying not to do metaphysics, but that'll be in the question. But yeah, he's primarily an epistemologist. Although I think cognitive psychology is actually very faculty-based in a way. Modularity of the mind and functions and things like that. But that's a whole other can of worms. So it would be faculties in a different sense.
So we have ideas from experience. We mix and mash these ideas together. There's some method and regularity to that. And we're off. So this is in the section entitled, Section 4, Skeptical Doubt about the Operation of the Understanding. He says, the objects of human reason or enquiry can be divided into two kinds, the relations of ideas and matters of fact. And as an example of what he calls a relation of ideas, he speaks of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic. He says, these are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is or is not. So it doesn't matter whether or not there ever has been a circle, ever will be a circle. The work of geometry that describes what a circle is, etc., is what it is. And he says this is where sort of necessary truths sit. Matters of fact are not logically necessary and can admit of opposite or non-possibility, and are typically, they can be demonstrated or shown. Even if they never have been contradicted, you can, for example, say, a matter of fact might be that I have a plush doll in my office of Towley from South Park.
That's interesting. Well, is it just a towel?
It's a little plush doll, and if you squeeze his hand, it says something like, "Want to get high?"
Okay, all right.
But another matter of fact would be something like, the sun will rise tomorrow. That this is something that could not happen. It might not happen that the sun would rise tomorrow, but the fact that it does rise could be demonstrated or shown in the sense that you could stand there and watch it happen, or you could point out all the times. They're two qualitatively different things. I did have a question about how something like geometry, algebra, and arithmetic then relate to the idea that everything can be reduced to simple ideas that you get from experience. So if there never has been a circle or never would be a circle, would we have the concept of a circle in geometry?
Well, that seems to be exactly the kind of abstraction that I was talking about, how he thinks you could get an idea of God or something. Because we see circles, things that are approximately circles, that are just evidently circular. They look circular, and we see enough of those, and we can see some of them are more bumpy than others, so we can imagine then, by combining our ideas, a perfectly circular one. So that's how we would get this idea. I just don't know if using sort of the infinite like that works based on what he thinks we have to operate with.
The only way I could make this work for me was, if you said something like, well, we have experience of multitudes of things. Like, I have 5 books, so I have some experience of what I call 5. But I never have any direct experience of the number 5 or of fiveness or anything like that. But I have the experience of counting multiple things, and hence I can develop the system of arithmetic, and then I can posit a number like 8,553,000,000, blah, 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 which is a number I have never had any direct experience of, and I've never counted that many things, I've never been around that many things that I could count, but I can posit it and it makes sense. Yep. And so you could do the same thing with geometric forms, where you could hypothesize about a 27-sided figure, but never had an experience of it. And that's a combination of, it's a compound idea that you build out of your experience of, let's say, roughly square things or things with sides, that have dimensions, and that, so all these disciplines are available to us that way. That was the only way I could get that to make sense, somehow tie it back to experience.
I like that it's a system that they've developed. So talking about relations of ideas means you could create sort of an elaborate system, and then things within that system will be true by definition. And we totally saw this in Wittgenstein in a very developed way in the Tractatus episode. But he doesn't go into that kind of detail, of course. But just thinking about math, he really says specifically, and near the end of the book, he says, you can create this whole system like that for math, and therefore the truths of mathematics are true based just on pure reason. You don't have to consult your experience then. But it really only works for math. For geometry. Like, if you try to do that for anything else, if you try to make a system of logic based on that or whatever, it's just a load of crap. Right? For Hume.
Well, I think since you mentioned Wittgenstein, right, there's an analogy here. The atomic facts are the matters of fact, right? And the logical relation between all the different atomic facts are what builds them into, let's say, complex ideas for Hume. And then the relations could be all logical. So you can have everything's derived from experience, but you could have, say, so you could also call this, because it's what it will be called later on in the tradition, a distinction between analytic and synthetic. So relations of ideas are analytic. So you could say all bachelors are unmarried men because it's definitional, is analytic, or any analysis of a concept or an idea into its sub-ideas. So, for instance, all red balls are red is sort of a decomposition, an analytic decomposition.
This idea.
Which involves relations of ideas. And so geometry and algebra and arithmetic obviously as well fall into that category. It's not like you go and observe in nature that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a analytic truth that's not derived from experience.
That's interesting, Wes. Not that you brought in technical jargon that we'll learn in Kant, but the examples he uses, geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, all deal with ideas of things which are, let's just call them ideal or abstract. So in other words, the number 1 as a concept, you can have one thing in the world, but you can't have the number 1. It doesn't exist in the world. You can have a single thing, you can have a scrawl on a sign on a piece of paper that represents the concept, whatever. But when you use the example, all bachelors are unmarried men, I almost wanted to ask myself,
to punch you because that's such an overused example?
No. It's been a long time since I heard that one. I think I invoked Cicero as Tully at some point before too, so we could play a little game of punch bug or whatever, and Wes could get me back. But I wonder whether that would count as a relation of ideas for Hume, or would that somehow still be a matter of fact? I almost get the sense that Hume would say,
No, it's not a matter of fact.
For Hume?
No, for Hume, no. I mean, bachelor is also a concept which can be instantiated in the world, right? There can be relations between he mentions geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, but there can be relations between any sorts of
Sure,
ideas.
and that's actually how you do ethics, too.